Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies is pleased to be having you tonight, as well as be holding and convening this very exceptional event about the death, devastation, and international law in the Gaza Strip, Palestine. We will be having several distinguished panelists. It is now exactly 5:30. I know we are starting sharp. We will be waiting until the rest of the panelists are with us, but I can see that practically nearly all of them, apart from our distinguished guest from the Gaza Strip, who of course we understand he will be having connectivity issues, but I hope that we will overcome those. Nonetheless, we will be starting at the moment. Without further ado, at least I have this opportunity to present our eminent speakers. We have with us, and I hope that the control room is watching and seeing Professor Christin Chinkin. I can see her definitely. And I can see that Professor John Dugard is with us as well. And I can see as well that Professor Richard Falk is with us as well. So practically we are waiting for Advocate Raji Sourani from the Gaza Strip, which I hope he will be with us shortly. Of course, he will do his best to connect in the calamitous situation in the Gaza Strip. Ladies and gentlemen, normally chairmen struggle to beautify and sometimes to polish out of friendliness and collegiality to present the guest speakers. However, I do not have this challenge tonight. All our speakers are eminent intellectuals and practitioners in the field of law and in the discipline, the academic discipline of law. Practically, I am not sure if I will be saying everything that they deserve to be said, because each one of them is a towering intellectual and academic with a long assets behind him, academic and humanitarian assets behind him. Without actually any particular order, or maybe with perhaps a gender order, I'd like to present first, I present all of them in the beginning until we have Raji Sourani with us, to present first Professor Christin Chinkin. Now, the most important thing is that she was one of the authors of the Goldstone report with regards to Palestine. But obviously, beside this, she was the director of the Center for Women, Peace and Security between 2015 and 18 at the London School of Economics in London. She's a leading expert on international law and human rights law, especially in the human rights of women. Professor Chinkin has been a consultant or advisor to UN bodies on a range of issues, including human trafficking, gender-based persecution in armed conflict, peace agreements, and gender and violence against women. She was obviously a member of the UN fact-finding missions about the Gaza Strip, which produced the Goldstone report, which was discussed at the UN in 2009. I can see now, and I'm delighted to see as well, that Advocate, the director of the Palestinian Human Rights Center, Raji Sourani, is also with us. I'm really delighted that we are convening on this very unfortunate days perhaps, but we are very fortunate to have all of these international figures with us. Just because our main speaker, or the only speaker from Palestine, from the heart of the Gaza city, Mr. Raji Sourani, is with us, and he might, who knows, have some connectivity issues, I would suggest, please, ladies and gentlemen, to start first, if I may, panelists, start with Mr. Raji Sourani, so that he can give us his first report, and then we can take it from there. To come with clean hands and how the days pass and how the situation doesn't change. 35 years ago, when the Israeli airplanes were shelling just near the Al-Shifa hospital in the Gaza Strip, one of the places, the locations that I found myself on was the roof of the Souranis in the Gaza Strip. So we have known one another for at least 35 years. At that day, I was shot in the face as a journalist, rescued under fire, and brought to the world the story of the first Palestinian Intifada. So Mr. Raji Sourani is practically a leading advocate and a human rights expert. He's an international human rights expert, but especially he's one of the few leading Palestinian human rights lawyers. I'll have to say that to survive in Gaza, not only physically, but as well to be respected and to act in a very respectful manner takes a very unique personality such as Raji's. Raji has been defending under all, it seems, authorities, the Israeli, the Fatah or the PNA and the Hamas, and he has been operating under not easy circumstances, but I must say to be respected by, well, at least not the occupation, at least Palestinian factions, is quite an achievement. Raji has spearheaded not only his legal practice in the past, but as well as established a very important human rights center in the Gaza city, which has been persistently collecting abuses of human rights from every possible source. Many challenges faced Raji Sourani, but he truly remained robust and relentless, and hopefully, and he will remain, because in as much as he has been dealing with human rights abuses locally, he is as well involved with the ICC issues and maybe representing Palestinians victims. Without further ado, please, Mr. Raji Sourani, Advocate Raji Sourani, my colleague, our friend, we are delighted to have you with us, and thank you for your time. The screen and the mic are yours.
Thank you, Makram. Thank you for this fantastic, honorable panel. It's very timely. I'm talking to you from Gaza. Since first hour, since first day, for this criminal offensive on the Gaza Strip, the Israeli occupation army targeted deliberately, intentionally, civilians and civilian targets. And I can assure you, as far as we are collecting data and evidence and visit the places and where this took place, 90% of these targets are civilian targets. It's unprecedented that one of the most mighty armies in the world, and the mighty army of the Middle East, and with the most high-tech F-35 jet fighters, and with the most high-tech bombs used, like GU-31 and 72, bombing residential areas, like they are targeting Hanadi towers, entirely residential tower, or Johara tower. It's entirely for journalists and media, regional and international, or Al-Jara Tower, which is for Al Jazeera, AP, and New York Times, or talking about Al-Shuruq Tower, the incubator for journalism and media in Gaza. It's ugly, sad, bad when these jet fighters target COVID-19 only laboratory in Gaza, or the desalination plant of water, which is one of 3 desalination water plants in entire Gaza. It's ugly to see how these Israeli F-35 bombing the streets and taking out water pipes, sewage pipes, and destroy electricity in the Gaza Strip. It's unprecedented that they target the office of the Interior Minister of Gaza, very important security target. It's unprecedented. You know, they target apartments in Al Wahda Street, as if Abu al-Auf family, Al Kolak family, with their 43 inhabitants in it, whose their body, blood, nerves, minds mixed with the stones due to maybe 16 rockets bombed at these buildings, and till now we don't know whether there is some corpse still there or not, including many children. So far, this is happening on day to day, deliberately, intentionally, for the 11 consecutive days and nights. Gaza, you know it better than me, 365 square kilometers, living at 2.2 million people. This is the most dense populated area on earth. So if you throw stones from jet fighters, it will hurt and kill people. But they are not sending that. They are sending death from the sky, from the sea, from land, bombing, gunships bombing, tanks, artillery. No safe haven in Gaza. No one can think or believe next morning will come. He or she or their families will live next day or see the next day. They are intentionally inflicting pain and suffering on the hearts and minds of 2.2 million people in Gaza. They are stripping us from our dignity. They say you shouldn't exist in this part of the world. You should leave, or you have to revolt on the resistance. You have to revolt against Fatah and Hamas and PFLP, Jihad Islamic, because we can't do nothing for them so far. They're still strong, effective, and hitting us hard. This is unprecedented war. And I'm talking in presence of most wonderful, respected academics on earth, Richard Falk, Chinkin, John Dugard, and there is no, to my best of knowledge, war launched against civilians. It's target civilians and civilian targets. It's international law, international humanitarian law is there to protect civilians at the time of war. what Israel is doing, they are targeting civilians. They are killing, destroying, and they want to put you in a position you have no hope. You have to give up. You have to be a good victim. As if Gaza needs that. We have 54 years of criminal belligerent occupation. I don't need to give evidence on that. The evidence that the ICC decided to open investigation about suspected crimes and crimes against humanity committed by this belligerent occupation. As if it's not enough, we have 14 years of persecution, of criminal, illegal, inhuman siege, suffocated our life, socially and economically, and brought Gaza to unprecedented situation, shifting us to be a nation of beggars, waiting the charities and donations from international community. Shame on them. As if it's not enough that we have 3 wars in 5 years, and we were not able even to rebuild Gaza after that. And they said it in 2014, we will send Gaza to the Stone Ages. And like any other part on earth, we have COVID-19, but we have this COVID-19 with entirely destroyed medical infrastructure. We are lack of medicine, lack of equipments, lack of everything. And that's why we have very high rate of deaths among those who had this pandemic. And above all that, they do this criminal war against civilians. It's a big shame for this so-called the most moral army on the globe. The target of this moral army, Abu al-Auf family, al-Hadidi family, and other children. But what 67 children did for them as far? What 37 women did for the state of Israel as far? More than 65% of those who has been killed, women and children and entirely civilians, have nothing to do with anything. All what Israeli excuses are giving, does it mean anything? I don't know for how long this will continue, but what's shocking me more, that Security Council, who should activate Chapter 7 for peace and security in the world, not able only not to take resolution, but even a statement, press release unable to produce. Why? Because US not satisfied with sending their jet fighters, F-35, and the most high-tech bombs to Israel freely, but they are providing them with full legal political impunity, and the Security Council totally paralyzed. And when we look to Europe, it's scandalous, balanced, nice political and diplomatic language, even-handed, and they are putting Palestinians, Israeli belligerent occupation on the same equal level. This is a big shame on Europe, and Europe shouldn't be proud of that. And we are telling both the Americans and the Europeans, sorry, we cannot be the slaves of old Rome. When the law applies on masters and doesn't apply on slaves, we have dignity and we deserve freedom. 73 years since the Nakba occurred, and once and again, they want to make Sheikh Jarrah people new refugees, as if they didn't satisfy with the Nakba in 1948. Even the most holy place, Dome of the Rock, they are not happy with the ethnic cleansing they are doing. They are not happy with the Judaization they are doing. But in the most holy month, Ramadan, soldiers, Knesset members, police, ministers, go inside these mosques and with their shoes, with their bombs, with their arms insulting women, children, all young, and they want settlers, extremists to take over in the most holy place, as if Jerusalem, it's for Jerusalemite, as if Sheikh Jarrah, it's only for the people of Sheikh Jarrah. Should we accept the new brand of apartheid in the West Bank? That's not what we are saying. We said that in 2001 in Durban at the World First Conference Against Racism. We said then, as Palestinian human rights activist organizations, as international human rights organizations and civil society, the Israeli occupation new brand of apartheid. Nobody believed that, including the fantastic Mayor Robinson, who was then the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But now B'Tselem saying Israeli new brand of apartheid. Human Rights Watch saying Israel new brand of apartheid. And this shouldn't continue and this should stop. That's why the level of anger, frustration came to the peak. And we have no tolerance for that anymore. And enough is enough. That's the message of Palestinian people to the whole world. That's why people, not only in Sheikh Jarrah or Jerusalem, in Lod, Haifa, Jaffa, in al-Fahim, Ramallah, Jenin, Tulkarim, Hebron, and the Gaza Strip revolted. The Palestinian people inside and outside get together, united in a clear-cut message. We have no compromise. We have to have an end for this criminal belligerent occupation. We have to have an end for this aggression, for this ongoing war against civilians. We have to have an end for this new brand of apartheid. We have dignity. We deserve freedom. We will pay for it and we will have it. We want to practice our right of self-determination and independence. We are not going to forget or forgive all those criminals who deliberately and intentionally committed these war crimes in a flagrant violation of international law, which broadcasted at the real time from the real places for the entire world. All Palestinians want A and B. International law, B, in practice and to enjoy it. And we want freedom and dignity. That's what we need. Facts are clear, and I can assure you, with all the blood, with all destruction, with all this blanket of terrorism, state terrorism, Israel trying to spread all over the occupied territories, we have no right to give up. We have no right to be good victims, and no power on earth will take from our hearts and minds hope that tomorrow is ours. We know we are defending just, fair, right cause. We know we are in the right side of history, and we know and we are sure one day we shall overcome. We are strong enough. You can count on us, but we are much, much more stronger with the support of the free, committed people across the globe who are giving this fantastic solidarity and support for Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji, for this historical document, in fact, that you have just provided us with. I'm truly appreciative. I thought to re-mention, perhaps, that we are really honored to have with us three eminent scholars, Professor Christin Chinkin, Professor John Dugard, and Professor Richard Falk. The three of them were involved, or are still in this way or another, at least academically, involved with the situation in Palestine. Two of them, Professor John Dugard and Professor Richard Falk, were UN special rapporteurs to Palestine. And as I mentioned earlier, Professor Chinkin was one of the authors of the Goldstone report. If I may, Professor John Dugard is a renowned scholar, internationally renowned scholar of international law. He is a professor of international law at the moment at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He was, as I said, a UN special rapporteur between 2001 and 2008. He has got a long list of professional publications. He held numerous prestigious positions, but most importantly and relevant to our discussion tonight is that he was for over 7 years the UN Special Rapporteur, and we are delighted that you are with us, Professor Dugard. So the screen and the mic are yours, please.
Yes, thank you, Makram. I'm just going to raise two issues in order to get discussions going. The first issue concerns the question of targeting of civilians. I heard an interview with Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday in which he assured us that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are very careful not to target civilians, that the IDF is the most moral army in the world, and that great care is taken not to inflict collateral damage on civilians. Well, the evidence simply does not support this. Let me add that, like Christine, Chinkin, I also carried out an investigation, fact-finding mission after Operation Cast Lead, this time on behalf of the Arab League. And on that occasion, it became very clear to me that civilians had been targeted, and that was also the finding of the Goldstone Commission. Richard Goldstone subsequently recanted to some extent, arguing that the Israeli Defense Forces had not deliberately targeted civilians. But to me, it was very clear that in 2008 and 2014, and now again, the IDF deliberately targets civilians in some respects, and in other respects, it must be held accountable because it inflicts collateral damage, knowing full well of the likely consequences and being reckless as to whether these consequences follow. And that provides the necessary intention for the war crime of attacking civilian targets. I want to suggest that the time has come to raise the question of whether the attack on Gaza constitutes the crime of genocide. This is a major step which scholars are reluctant to address. In 2008, when I conducted the fact-finding mission into Operation Cast Lead, there were 6 members of the commission, and I was the only one who was reluctant to find that genocide had occurred. All my other colleagues insisted that it was genocide. Again, in 2014, when the Russell Tribunal sat, it debated the question of whether genocide had occurred, and I was a dissenting voice again, arguing that we could not take this great step. Instead, the Russell Tribunal held that some of the statements made by Israelis constituted an incitement to genocide. But I think today, if one looks at the statements made by Prime Minister Netanyahu and military leaders and general members of the public in Israel, there is probably sufficient evidence to support a finding that there is the necessary specific intent for the crime of genocide, which amounts to the destruction of a group of people in whole or in part. I don't wish to make any conclusive comments on this, but I do think that the time has come for us to start considering the question of whether Israel's conduct amounts to genocide. I think this would focus the mind of the general public on the actions of the Israeli Defense Forces. So that's the first comment that I wish to make, and I'd be to hear what others think about this. The other point that I want to make is that we should be looking to the future. Hopefully a ceasefire will soon be declared, and at this time there will be talk about instituting the peace process, which I think is very necessary. But I think we must face the fact that the United States has disqualified itself as an honest broker. It's very strange if one looks back that President Arafat believed that the key to the future of Palestine lay in the United States, and Abu Mazen has continued this approach to look to the United States for salvation. But I think the Biden administration has made it clear that the United States is an ally of Israel and is not an honest broker. This has become abundantly clear from the refusal of the United States to support any statement from the Security Council, in effect to veto any statement. I cannot understand why the 14 other members of the Security Council have not put forward a resolution to compel the United States to veto the resolution, which would have made it abundantly clear that the United States is against a peaceful settlement. But that's the first bit of evidence which disqualifies the United States. The other is that the Biden administration has refused to withdraw the decision of the Trump administration to relocate the American embassy to Jerusalem. And that indicates that there's not really much distinction between the Trump administration and the Biden administration when it comes to the issue of Palestine. And then finally, of course, there is the fact that the United States pays tribute to Israel. I know it likes to argue that it is paying foreign military aid, but it's really tribute of the kind that Roman dependencies used to pay to the Roman Empire for tribute. And they pay $3.8 billion of military equipment or money to Israel for military assistance. And at present, they are debating giving another $700 million to Israel, I think. And so it's very clear that if one looks at all this evidence that the United States is totally disqualified and that we have to look to other actors. Obviously, the Security Council is the body that should take the initiative, and I hope it will succeed in doing so, failing which, of course, the Uniting for Peace resolution might take steps to establish a mediator or to hold an international conference for this purpose. But we have to simply eliminate Washington from the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dugard, for these 3 points. Professor Richard Falk is back. I am sure that he is more than known, and some of our viewers tonight must have attended our previous book discussion series that the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies runs, and we had the world premiere volume launch of Citizen Pilgrim, the public intellectual by Professor Falk, and obviously he's got many other books about Palestine and international law. And as I said, he was as well a UN Special Rapporteur to Palestine between 2008 and 2008 and 2014. Professor Falk, you are with us now. I understand that you noticed that there was a potential hack or hacking on your device, but I'm delighted that you are with us, and I was wondering whether you would like to make a few comments, please.
Yes, thank you, Makram. Was very moved by Raji Sourani's opening statement that spoke from the heart as well as from the head, and has experienced the full existential horror of the present crisis. And it is a crisis that internationally has been badly distorted and deformed by the way it's presented. It's essentially been decontextualized in two ways that I think are extremely unhelpful if one wants to appreciate the legal and moral and political dimensions of what is happening. Prior to the exchange of rocket fire and massive Israeli attacks on Gaza, there were a series of events, provocative events, orchestrated by the Netanyahu government in Israel, almost certainly designed to produce some kind of Hamas reaction. He referred to the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, which are a metaphor for the Nakba, as he's also mentioned, and that experience of being ethnically cleansed from your own homeland is something that has been an ongoing criminal scandal for all these years. And it's a process, not an event back in 48 that has inflicted great suffering. And then the activism of the right-wing settlers in Jerusalem, in Palestinian neighborhoods, shouting slogans such as "Death to the Arabs," was in the midst of Ramadan, is bound to lead to violence and rioting. And to culminate these kind of provocations prior to the attacks on Gaza and from Gaza were the intrusions on worship in Al-Aqsa compound and mosque at the height of Ramadan, and something that has in the past activated Palestinian resistance. So these contextual events are erased in the international dominant discourse, which has first emphasized what the Biden administration has said repeatedly: Israel has a right to defend itself, as if it's an innocent victim of Hamas's attack, and emphasizing that Hamas is a terrorist organization, which of course has been treated ever since the 9/11 attacks on the US as outside the protection of law. And this way of, this reductive way of understanding what is happening is shocking. But more shocking is to ignore the context in Gaza itself. This is an area, again, as Raji has very vividly portrayed it, that even without being attacked is in facing a humanitarian challenge of the highest magnitude. And it's been unlawfully blockaded since 2007, with great consequences for its material and psychological well-being. The economy is wrecked, over 50% unemployment. The fact of being confined has traumatized virtually the entire Gazan population. In addition, it's in the midst of the COVID crisis that has overburdened a medical system that was already deprived of the means for normal operations. And all of this occurs in a territory that by international humanitarian law continues to be occupied by Israel, and Israel owes it a special set of duties to protect the civilian population. And in Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, there is even a specific intensified obligation in a time of contagious disease and epidemic. Not only is it shocking that this context is being subjected to this high technology military violence, but that the outside world more or less ignores it and focuses the entire energy on sort of getting both sides to agree to a ceasefire, which of course is something everyone desires, but to treat the two sides as equal and to ignore the contexts is to dehumanize the people of Gaza and to make international humanitarian law irrelevant to our understanding of the conflict and how it should be resolved. Even though Israel is committing severe crimes, ignoring world public opinion, ignoring their legal obligations, they are confident that they enjoy a geopolitical grant of unconditional impunity. And it is for that reason that, as John Dugard pointed out, we are so disappointed by the silence of the UN and by the role of the US in not even allowing it to issue a Security Council resolution in a situation of acute humanitarian emergency. It's a terrible moment, I think, of failure on the part of the international community as well as European Union and the United States. And we must be very sad that this has come to pass and that the people of Gaza are once more subjected to the fury of high technology attacks and are defenseless, essentially, to do anything about them. We hope that something will come in the future to make this the last such attack on the people of Gaza. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Richard Falk, for this intervention, which ties smoothly with the 3 points that Professor John Dugard earlier pointed out. And now I'm delighted to give the floor practically via Zoom, the screen and the mic to Professor Christin Chinkin. I mentioned earlier parts of her biography or CV, but I'd like to mention to those who were latecomers or are latecomers that Professor Chinkin was one of the authors of the Goldstone report, and she's a professor of international law, specializing in women, peace and security. Professor Chinkin, I think you need to unmute yourself, if I am not mistaken, or yeah, just we can see you obviously. Yes, Professor.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. As Richard just said, I too was very moved by Raji's account, and not just very moved. I think two other emotions. One was shame to be an international lawyer. It seems that a situation where the international law is clear, we have IHL, we have international criminal law, we have international human rights law. Yes, obviously, in any particular case, the facts have to be assessed against the law. But what we saw back in 2009 with the Goldstone report, and I remember as spending a long time at that point, trying to think about ways in which we could make recommendations for the future, looking to the different institutions of the United Nations to act in response to findings that have been made. And so we have the Security Council that we've just heard from both John and Richard, which is failing in taking any steps. The ICC, yes, has now determined that it's got jurisdiction, but we also know that that's going to be a very long process. Human Rights Council creates fact-finding missions. There were further fact-finding missions, certainly in 2014, I think others as well. And yet we still do not see concrete results. And as I say, I think that makes me feel both sad and ashamed as to be the exponent of a legal regime that does not seem to be able to resolve a situation such as this. To pick up on a couple of points that have been made earlier, Richard has talked about the importance of context and the particular context in Gaza. I'd go a stage further again. Somebody, I think it was Raj, talked about the commission of these acts with impunity. And I think we just have to think how in the last decade or so, possibly longer, we see impunity breeding impunity over and over again. Think Yemen, think Syria. And I think that we have to see what happens in Gaza as part of that bigger picture, that growing assumption that violence of this sort can be used and the result will be impunity, and that the international community will not act, whoever it is that is committing crimes, to make effective the implication of international law. John raised the issue of genocide, and again, like him, without going into whether or not that is a charge that can be upheld. I think what's important to remember about genocide is the obligation on the international community to prevent genocide. And so whether or not it is genocide, if there is a possibility of it, then the steps should be taken to prevent that genocide. And that is an obligation on the international community. And again, there have been attempts to try to develop the idea of the responsibility of the international community outside the concept of genocide. So, for example, we had the responsibility to protect. Okay, that doctrine, for various reasons, did not fly as a long-term doctrine. But I think what was important of that doctrine was the understanding that the international community has a responsibility when the primary responsibility for protection of civilians is not being upheld. And that surely has to be greater when the situation is internationally recognized as one of occupation, and when the occupier is not protecting, that the international community should be stepping in to take steps for protection. The other context, and again, I think both Raj and Richard have mentioned this, is COVID-19. And beyond the pressures on the medical system, when we saw those when we as part of the Goldstone back in 2009, yeah, everywhere else in the world, we're being told to social distance. We're told to stay in lockdown. And we're told to try to prevent transmission of COVID-19. Well, that clearly is not possible when people are having to flee buildings, have nowhere to go. How do you possibly socially distance in the middle of events such as those that Raj was just talking about? So I think that the context of these events occurring in the middle of a pandemic on top of the overall obligations are even greater. Richard raised looking forward towards the peace process. Again, one has to think, is uniting for peace a possibility? Could that be used in a way to try and have a unbiased and impartial approach to the peace process? And I would, from my own background, just flag also the Women, Peace and Security resolutions, which insist upon participation on a much more inclusive level, including participation of women in such processes. But clearly, again, the situation is one that is calling for leadership within the international community that we're just not seeing at the moment. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Professor Christin Chinkin. Before I go back to Raji Sourani in the Gaza Strip, or he's in the Gaza City in particular, may I just go back to our distinguished panelists, Professor Richard Falk and Professor John Dugard. Whilst listening and watching you, we, like many probably others, we are reading now that it may well be that Netanyahu would like to declare a unilateral ceasefire. Could you please, Professor Richard Falk and Professor John Dugard, refer to the legality of this, or the tradition or the context of a unilateral ceasefire, and what are the implications and the repercussions, if there are any, in international law, please? Richard, please. Or yeah, please.
Well, my sense is that a unilateral declaration of a ceasefire is a meta-legal undertaking, that it's a matter of diplomacy, and it doesn't erase any of the prior criminality of the use of force, and it seems to me to be an effort to calm the relationship with the US and the international community by seeming to act as one who brings peace. It's sort of a grotesque and perverse kind of effort of Netanyahu to paint his image in internationally as a peacemaker, while domestically as a warmonger, which he's been accused of trying to use this flare-up of violence as a way of ensuring his continuity of leadership within Israel. So my sense is that one should welcome the end of violence, if that's what it is, but understand it to be an extra legal way of trying to engage in unilateral diplomacy, which is a means, I think, in this setting of invalidating the other, invalidating Hamas as entitled to join in a negotiated end of the violence. So it has a political edge to it, I would think, in keeping with the Israeli view that Hamas is a terrorist organization and not entitled to be treated as a political actor.
Thank you, Professor Richard Falk. Professor John Dugard, may I please have your take on this issue, please?
Yes, I agree with Richard that this is an extra legal instrument, the unilateral ceasefire. I think it's important to stress that one cannot expect a bilateral ceasefire in these circumstances because Israel is determined not to have any dealings with Hamas. And of course, the bizarre thing is that the same applies to the United States and the United Nations and the European Union, for that matter. They are determined not to have any dealings with Hamas. And so inevitably, any ceasefire in this situation would have to be unilateral. But I would like to ask Raji how Hamas is likely to respond to a unilateral ceasefire. On previous occasions, Egypt has broken a ceasefire which both parties have seen as binding upon them. But if this is to be a one-sided affair in which Israel halts activities without any consent on the part of the other state or the other party, will it respect it? So Raji, I'd very much appreciate your opinion on this subject.
Thank you, Professor Dugard. So the floor is yours, Advocate Raji Sourani from the Gaza Strip, please. Raji, can you hear me?
Yes, I mean, while we are talking, I mean, for the last hour or so, there was non-stop bombing all over the place around us. And the table is shaking, the house is shaking. And this is continuing, and this is, I think, going to continue for some time. Israel want to eat the whole pig. They are so determined, and as far they have great failure in achieving anything on the political level and on the security level. Regarding Hamas and the Jihad Islamic and the resistance, I mean Gaza, I witnessed the 3 previous offensive of Israel, and I'm witnessing this, I mean, for the 4th time. This time, resistance, obviously, I mean, assured, confident, in control. They haven't been affected so far, I mean, in any significant way. Chain of command still, I mean, good. Yes, we have quite a lot of destruction. We have a lot of killings and injuries. There is tens of thousands who fled northern area, eastern areas of Gaza after Israel opened the gate of hell on these residential areas, and people has no other choice but to leave. And they are at UNRWA schools, using it as shelters. Yes, Israel blocking entirely, 100% Gaza, not allowing rations, food, medical aids, I mean, to come in. But with all that, you know, still people very determined, not giving up, the morale high. And I think this is unique political juncture. And what had happened before this offensive, before this war, never will be again. I think we are heading for entirely a new political era. There is something deep changed, not only in the hearts and minds of the people, but as well in the ground. And there is very, very strong message conveyed to Israel. And I think that's what they cannot digest. As I said, not myself, but I'm following extensively the Israeli Hebrew media. And they said, we didn't achieve any security or political significant thing. We just hit civilian targets, and that deterring nobody. Neither civilians and their solidarity with the resistance, neither Hamas or Jihad Islamic and others. So this is unique and this is special. I don't want to argue about Hamas legitimacy, whether we like it or not, whether ideology or politically we support it or not. This is totally irrelevant. I personally don't like any religious parties, but I think they are part of us, part of our political mathematics and chemistry, part of our political legitimacy, and they are defending the people. Now, can anybody ignore them? They tried. But I think this time, nobody will jump. Ceasefire cannot be achieved without negotiating them. And I think, many parties are right now contacting them. Yes, in the future, in the near future, we have some really change in the political spectrum for the Palestinian people. It's very early to judge it 100%, but there is solid facts on the ground cannot be ignored from now on.
Mr. Raji Sourani, if I may, as a chair, I'm allowing myself to ask one question, please. Assuming the declaration of a unilateral ceasefire by Netanyahu will be made tomorrow, assuming, what do you think will happen next? And are we expecting the political route to be resumed, the diplomatic, or perhaps do you think, because you are there, will it be ignored and the Palestinian side can practically try to decide on its own route? On this very point, if I may make one observation, when we talk about the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and especially those who are called resistance, I'll have to stress out as an academic and as an observation I'm giving it, we are not talking only about Hamas or about its own paramilitary brigades. We are talking about the Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, and Kata'ib al-Aqsa. So we are talking at least about 4 factions, paramilitary factions that are working, it seems, together or separately, but they are practically involved in this paramilitary activities. And so back just to the question, please, Raji, if you could please refer to this. Where are we going, assuming this unilateral declaration is made?
First, I want to assure you one thing. Everybody in the occupied territories, Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, people inside the Green Line, inside Israel, and in the diaspora, united behind the resistance. This is clear-cut way. Thanks for Netanyahu, he united us again. Thanks for the Israeli crimes, united us again. It's our law of survival. We are united again. And everybody know our dignity, and our fate in the hand of resistance. Second, I think the status quo broken. This is not going to continue in the future, and nobody will allow that to continue in the future. The status quo before this war was clear. We don't exist for Israel. There is ethnic cleansing. There is a new brand of apartheid. There is no Palestinian state. There is Eretz Israel. There is Jewish state. Jerusalem, the eternal capital for Israel, as Trump and Biden so far supported. We are not going to accept that. Enough is enough. After 73 of Nakba and after 54 years of belligerent criminal occupation, we cannot tolerate that our more. We want end of the occupation. We want self-determination. We want independence. Otherwise, we have no right to be good victims for this criminal belligerent occupation, for this ethnic cleansing. It's about time for international community to stand for its not political, not moral, legal obligation. That's what all Geneva Convention about. That's what the international law and international material law and the human rights about. You should stand and observe and just give condemnation statements. And I want to remind everybody, we are entitled for simple right. It's called self-determination. Self-determination. We have to decide our fate and destiny, and we have to do our self-determination. Yes, we have ICC as lawyers, as people who believe in international law and Rome status and rule of law, but Palestine not going to be liberated by that. If international community doesn't stand for the unalienable rights of the Palestinian people, for ending the occupation, that would be disastrous. Now, I want to mention one thing. I want to mention very grave mistake among many, many others at Oslo Accords. There was no single word mentioned about ending the occupation or the occupation. There wasn't one single word mentioned about international law, international material law, and the human rights. This wasn't coincident. It was very intentional. I know the Israeli legal team. I know the head of the Israeli legal team. And we know the Israeli legal mentality. This wasn't coincident. It was very intentional. And that's why I'm saying the concluding lessons of all that, it's present in the hearts and minds of the leadership. And we paid for it extreme costly price. So it's about time for Hamas, for PFLP, for Fatah, for Jihad Islamic to take all these concluding lessons. And I don't think any can ignore or can just try to avoid these things. Unilateral ceasefire, it means nothing. It's like rewarding Israel. It cannot be done that way. And I think there is real negotiations happening now, and all of the Israeli offers for that are rejected. They want to do that. They want to make unilateral ceasefire. But this is something should be arranged and should be in agreement and it cannot be taken literally, like, all right, we'll stop firing at you and everything back to normal. No, I'm saying there is a new chapter, a new juncture, a new political reality, and that should be considered. Otherwise, this will be repetitive once and again.
Thank you, Raji. May I just, before I go back to Professor Chinkin and ask her about the impunity once again, please, may I just go back to Professor Richard Falk? Raji Sourani mentioned the point of, well, the point which doesn't appear to have written or mentioned in the Oslo Accords, which is the end of the occupation. And we know that in at least 2 of your books, Professor Richard Falk, you dwell on the issue of prolongation of occupation. What actually is your take from an expert on international law? How can you, as lawyers, as experts, tackle the prolongation or the period of occupation? Can it last forever?
Well, that was a question that challenged me during my 6 years as special rapporteur, and I raised repeatedly this issue. There is no cutoff for an occupation. It's just presumed to be a temporary matter. I proposed a 5-year limit on any kind of belligerent occupation as a way of restoring the rights of the occupied people. But even the International Committee of the Red Cross was not interested in that and felt comfortable with this open-ended belligerent occupation, which has been reinforced by the geopolitical muscle of the United States. Couldn't have lasted this way otherwise. And I completely agree with Raji when he criticizes the text of the Oslo Accords, omitting self-determination, the core right of a people, and at the center of what this has been about. I mean, the Palestinians have been denied self-determination in their own country, and they've been made to be strangers, persecuted strangers in their own country, which is an absolute perversion of what is meant to be the right to determine the
Skype video,
the future of a people, and it's been aggravated in the aggravated and acknowledged by Israel's Basic Law of 2018, which doesn't hide the apartheid nature of the Israeli state, and is, as has been said, this now has been confirmed by B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch. It's clear at this point that fundamental rights have to be restored. I'd like to hear what Raji thinks will happen after the violence subsides. Will there be a third intifada? Will there be a sense that Palestinian unity can be sustained, which will be, those will be game changers if indeed they happen, as I hope they will.
Please, Raji.
Well, I think we are united, and Palestinian people are really, I mean, for the first time, united from the wall to wall. I think we are in a new juncture.
Raji, we can't see you. Oh yeah, now it's fine.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say, we all, as the Palestinians, are united. Even the speech tonight of Dr. Riyad al-Malki, our foreign minister to the UN, was very clear and very strong, and he conveyed a very unprecedented message, I mean, by the Palestinian Authority. I think everybody knows this is a new juncture, a new era. The status quo, which used to be all the way long, this will not be repetitive once again. You know, I'll tell you something. I mean, what people in the region, and very, very interestingly, I mean, talking about it, people in Emirates and Saudi Arabia saying, oh, is this Israel who's going to confront Iran and its nuclear mighty? Is this Israel who's going to deal with Hezbollah? Can that happen? Are they going really to be able to confront them? If Gaza, this 365 square kilometers, which is under siege for 14 years, which subjugated to 3 wars, and people in Tel Aviv, in Netanya, began to feel its effect. What about others? But we think we have to consider the mighty Israel once and again as the power in the Middle East. This is something nobody, I mean, used to say it before. Egypt, it's Kafka, said, we are with Gaza. Palestinians have the right to defend themselves. Wow. I mean, even Egypt, I mean, saying that. You cannot see what's going on in the region from Morocco to Iraq. In Iraq, millions of people, I mean, put to the streets. In Syria, there in Kuwait, even in Qatar, I mean, big demonstrations. There is something moving, there is something changing. And I think the political leadership aware, they should catch the pulse. They see this international solidarity movement across the globe, in Europe, in Latin America, in US. This is amazing. I mean, really, I mean, what's going on.
I think, I'm afraid we lost Raji Sourani for a second, but if I may go back to Professor Christin Chinkin, please, and just follow up on your your note or comment with regards to impunity breeds impunity. As a specialist, an academic, and an expert in international law and international and human rights law, how can you, as an international legal community, how can you challenge or block this trend of immunity which breeds more immunity?
I wish I knew the answer. If I did, I would be far more effective as an international lawyer. This is probably the big question of the time with respect to so many places where we see the law clearly in place with respect to war crimes, crimes against humanity, gross violations of human rights, the international crime of aggression that is now accepted. Back in '98, when the International Criminal Court was created, there was the hope and expectation that this would open a new era of ending impunity. for various reasons, jurisdictional on the one hand, other issues on the other. This has not transpired, but the court has got jurisdiction. As we said earlier, it's accepted jurisdiction with respect to events from 2014 onwards. But I think we also have to remember that impunity is not just about individual responsibility, individual criminal responsibility. It's also about state responsibility. And the whole concept of state responsibility for the commission of international wrongs. And I think we come back here to the importance of the international community making strong statements with respect to state responsibility and the obligation that flows from an assertion of state responsibility relating to the payment, not necessarily financial, but other forms of reparation. And there are various attempts going on with respect to Myanmar, with respect to ISIS in Daesh, ISIS in particular, with respect to collection of evidence, documentation, all the necessary materials for the assertion of responsibility, whether individual or that of state organizations. But there's still a long way to go. We have, again, the law is there. And of course, then it also leads to the other issue of universal jurisdiction within domestic courts and whether states are willing to accept such universal jurisdiction and give effect to it, which again is something that many states are very reluctant to do.
Thank you, Professor Christine Chinkin. Professor John Dugard, if I may, would you say that the unfolding events until this very moment, at least, will encourage the ICC to act differently, to take a different path, or to slow down the process that they declared they wanted to take on, or will they actually combine cases? What will happen, do you think, or what routes does the ICC have in front of it and the possibilities that we may see?
Well, in respect of Palestine, the ICC has held that it has jurisdiction to hear the case, and it has now opened an investigation. Very much depends upon the office of the prosecutor, and next month we get a new prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Khoury-Machool of the United Kingdom, and one hopes that he will take this dossier very seriously and proceed as soon as possible with prosecutions. But let me just say that one of the most disheartening things about this is the way in which a number of states have, state parties to the Rome Statute have deliberately obstructed the prosecution. And here I'll refer to the settler states of Australia, Canada, the United States, and of course the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson, in an extraordinary statement, indicated that he is opposed to the investigation into the crimes committed by Israel. And this is very difficult because there are three key British officers in the court. There's a registrar, there's a judge, and in June there will be a prosecutor from the United Kingdom. And it's extraordinary that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom should make the statement that he is opposed to the prosecution. And I think when it comes to the question of impunity, one has to hold these countries responsible. And it's extraordinary that they are all the colonial settler states of Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, and the United States that oppose this prosecution. So I'm very hopeful that the ICC will proceed, but I'm very alarmed by the fact that a number of states of the kind that I've mentioned are deliberately obstructing the work of the ICC.
Right, okay, we've got 8 minutes, that's it. And may I just take 2 minutes from each one of you? Could I please ask Professor Richard Falk to wrap up the discussion from his point of view, then I'll move to Professor Chinkin, then once again to Professor Dugard, and then we'll give the floor for final remarks to Raji Sourani. Professor Falk, if I may, you need to unmute, please. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Makram. This has been a very moving and stimulating panel. I think I wish to echo the remarks of Raji Sourani to the effect that something has changed that's fundamental in the relationship between the Palestinian people and Israel. Exactly what that change will produce, I think, is uncertain, but there is an unprecedented degree of Palestinian unity, a recognition that resistance matters and can be effective, an international global an international response that is in civil society. I think we should look in the future, as in the past, combination of solidarity and resistance as the key to Palestinian emancipation. Governments, I think, will not be very effective. UN will not be very effective. I think it will depend, as in the South African case, that the end of Israeli apartheid will depend as much on what the popular mobilization around the world is and on the continuing sumud and steadfastness of the Palestinian people.
Thank you, Richard. May I, Professor Chinkin, if I may, if you could just unmute, please.
Thank you again. I really don't think I can say anything over and above what Richard has just said so eloquently. And to echo again, Raj, that while there are moves for change, that what we cannot forget is that any attempt to reassert the status quo after this particular bout of violence is a status quo of occupation and denial of self-determination that cannot continue. And that where the international community has failed, it is still important to remember the starting point of the rule of law, of international law, and that resistance has that international legal framework within which to work.
Professor Chinkin, I can't resist but ask you, we have witnessed in the last 10 days a lot of women victims as well as activists. What does your expertise actually tell us about the role of women in such events? I mean, where does the law stand with regards to women?
That's a big question at this point of the evening. The Women, Peace and Security agenda makes it very clear that women have important roles as leaders, that their voices must be heard in all aspects of decision-making around conflict, that they are agents, and that it's really important as well to look at the various roles that they are playing, both during the conflict and during the occupation, and looking towards the future, that they are not passive victims of the situation, and that in any moves forward, women's voices must be included as well as men's.
Thank you. That
I
was
could talk a lot longer about that.
No, that was great and good enough for now. Professor John Dugard, please, could I have your wrap up from your point of view, please?
Yes, I too have been deeply moved by Raji's comments this evening, and very heartened by his comments, which indicated there's a new spirit of unity on the part of the Palestinian people. And I hope this will be reflected in decision-making in capitals throughout the world. But I think we must be aware of the fact that states take a long time to respond to public opinion, and there's a lot of work ahead for all of us to make sure that international opinion changes, and that ultimately governments will be compelled to accept that public opinion has changed and that there is a need for a Palestinian state, and that they are all obliged to recognize Palestine as an independent state, to admit it to the United Nations, and to allow the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination.
Raji, please, the floor is yours for final comments, please.
The world should choose between rule of law and rule of jungle. Rule of jungle is not acceptable to us anymore. It's about time to have an end for that. Palestine is the test case for the whole world. I think what we are asking, not too much. We are asking for freedom, dignity, self-determination, nothing less or more than what international law, international humanitarian law stated for Palestinians. Once and again, we have no right to be good victims, and we cannot accept all this incredible dosage of the Israeli war crimes, crimes against humanity. It's about time to have an end for it. We are human beings. Our souls, our pain, our suffering, our blood, holy, like any human being suffering. And as a lawyer who represents victims, I'm telling the Israeli leaders, we are not going to forget or forgive. And we will target them and to bring them to the court of law one day for the deliberate crimes they committed against Palestinian people. Nobody can take from our hearts or minds the hope or our strategic optimism. We are so determined to overcome, and we will do that with the help and support of all free, committed people across the globe. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Raji Sourani, who spoke from the heart of the Gaza Strip, from the Gaza city, and provided us with a unique and authentic testimony, a live one. We were actually pleased that there weren't too many interruptions in your internet connection. I truly, on behalf of our Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies team, would like to express our gratitude and to say how privileged we have been to have four eminent figures. Professor Christin Chinkin, you have provided us with a tremendous amount of knowledge, but also with a magnificent angle, at least the one with regards to women. Professor John Dugard, we always learn from you. on every possible front. Your measured sentences and yet passionate statements have echoed and will echo. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the eminent and the distinguished Richard Falk, who, as usual, provided us with the most courageous approach, combining his free intellect as well as academic expertise. And again, thank you, Raji Sourani, so much. I would like as well to thank the hundreds of viewers who have viewed this unique event worldwide. And again, thank you, Professor Christine Chinkin. Thank you, Professor John Dugard. Thank you, Professor Richard Falk, and million thanks to our friend, the human rights lawyer, Raji Sourani from the Gaza Strip. Thank you all.